Here it is, 11.
Okay.
By my clock, it's 11:30 because I'm an hour ahead of you.
Well, if you can't see me, I'm sorry, but I can hear you.
So I found this chapter very interesting for several reasons. First of all, because several years ago, I was invited, I can't remember which church, to participate in a program that they were doing called the 7 Last Words of Christ. That these were that usually on Good Friday. I don't know if it was on a Friday, maybe it was on a Thursday. And I was given, the Archbishop was given one of those last words of Christ, and I was given one. Luckily, I was given this one. My God, why have you forsaken me? And it's the only one, or there actually two that come from Psalms. I don't remember what I said, but I tried to give an interpretation of the opening line of Psalms. So there are so these are claimed to be the 7 last words from the cross. And of course, this line comes from Psalm 22. It's the opening line. And for each of these 7 last words of Christ, they most of them appear just in one gospel or another. This one appears in both in Mark and Matthew. So the other, so only 2 of them are quotations from Psalms. This is one, and the other is, into your hands I commit my spirit. That was does that sound familiar to anyone? Into my hands I commit my spirit.
Rabbi, may I just ask that you refer to him as Jesus rather than Christ?
Yeah, I will do that, certainly. But into does that sound familiar to anyone? Father, into your hands I commit my spirit.
Yeah.
Think of the last line of Adon Olam, biyado afkid ruchi. Into his hand I commit my spirit. So you've said that line over and over and over again. If you've ever attended the end of services with Adon Olam, you have that line. It's good that we do this, talk about Psalm 22 today, because it is part of the liturgy in many churches on Good Friday, which is tomorrow. This being Holy Week, started last Sunday with Palm Sunday, and this Sunday will be is Easter. Let's talk for a minute, for a little bit before we get to Psalm 22 about Psalms in general. There are 150 Psalms in the book of Psalms. We draw upon them heavily in the Siddur. I looked. One of our Siddurim in the back lists which Psalms you can find in there. And there, in our Siddur, there are listed 58 of the 150 Psalms are in our Siddur. And they are Kabbalat Shabbat, Friday night, is made up of 6 Psalms, from Psalm 95, 96, 97, 98, 99, and 29. Every holiday we read Hallel. Hallel is consisted of 6 Psalms. There is a what's called Shir Shel Yom, a Psalm of the day. And then there additional, not only the 7 Psalms of each of the days, but there's a Psalm for the month of Elul, there's a Psalm for House of Mourning. So there are 11 of those. And on Saturday, every day, but especially on Shabbat morning, the whole introductory part of the service is made up largely of Psalms, 17 of them. So, we read Psalms a lot, not Psalm 22, interestingly. And why do we avoid Psalm 22? I don't really know, but I assume because of the Christological connections.
Are these Psalms supposedly all written by Solomon?
No, Psalms are traditionally were attributed to King David, and yet David probably had nothing to do with any of the Psalms. David lives around 1000 BCE. By the way, we still have no definitive proof that there really was a David. There are those who claim that they're digging up now Ir David in Jerusalem, the city of David, and they claim to have proof, but most archaeologists say we are still looking for actual archaeological proof that there was a David. But David supposedly lived 1000 BCE, and these Psalms, based on their vocabulary, are probably not from that period, but probably from as the author of our author says, probably from the pre-exilic period. In other words, before 586. So we're talking about the 6th, 7th century BCE, and David lives several hundred years before. So they are attributed to David, or at least many of them, but David probably did not write them. Our author talks about a biblical scholar named Gunkel. You ever heard of Gunkel before? Not a Jew, but Gunkel categorized the Psalms. He said they fit in various categories. There are Psalms that are simply hymns. There are Psalms that are songs of God's enthronement. There are some Psalms that are communal complaint Psalms, where they're in the plural complaint. There are royal Psalms. There are individual complaint songs. And there are individual Thanksgiving Psalms. So all 150 can be categorized in one of those six categories. I often think of them as simply emotional outbursts, because they express emotions at various occasions, and we still use them for that purpose. During times of crisis, it's traditional to turn to Psalms. When one is a shomer or shomeret, sitting with a dead body, the tradition is to read Psalms. These are emotional statements. And what's interesting, as our author points out, is that very often in biblical stories, and she gives a couple of examples, one of which we talked about last week, which was 2 weeks ago, which was Jonah. There is a narrative followed by what appears to be a poem. And very often the poem doesn't fit exactly. It sort of fits, but doesn't entirely fit. So here we have in Jonah, you'll remember, Jonah is swallowed by the large fish. We have the whole narrative. And then in the belly of the fish, there is a poem. And it doesn't sound like the poem doesn't necessarily fit it partially fits, but not totally fit the occasion. So the assumption is that there were standard poems, or poems that became sort of standard for various occasions. And we might do the same thing even today when we're feeling a certain either Thanksgiving or certain terrifying times. We might use our own words, and then we might turn to Psalm 23, right? We're all familiar with Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. As a, it is the sort of the standard that we get. And Gunkel not only said that there were 6, that we could put all 150 Psalms into one of 6 categories, but he also said that they had, each one of them followed a pattern. Usually there was an invocation. For individual laments, there was an invocation followed by a specific complaint, followed by calls on God for God's help, followed then by offers of God's motivation. Why should God listen to us? And conclusion, usually with a certainty that the plea will be heard. So when you have emotional statements, you don't want to say, "Oh, we can talk about it sort of in a scientific way rather than expressing the emotion." But they follow a certain pattern. So what's special about Psalm 22 for non-Jews? Let's see whether I can do this. Let me move everybody here over a little bit. What happened to my tabletop?
Enough to do it.
Where is my oops, I lost you guys.
Started somebody else.
Oh goodness. There you are. But I wanted to put you over here so that I could
Screen share.
Go ahead, say it.
Hi, sweetie.
Where's my tabletop? I can't go do Zoom if I can't get my tabletop.
It's a tabletop.
The desktop.
Oh.
It's a non-tech term.
Let's try it this way. If I press this, yeah, I think that's not going to help. Well, I'm gonna, if I don't get this quickly, I'm gonna give up on doing this.
Yes, pictures.
Oh, I think, what if I do, let me pull this over. And if I pull this over,
Nothing happened.
here we go. All right, now, whoops, now where'd you go? Okay. I think I've got it. By George.
George, he's dead too.
What? I think it's right there. There we go.
Ooh,
Yay.
Look at that.
yeah.
So this is the beginning. So here's the beginning. It begins with the words Lamanatseach al Ayelet Hashachar Mizmor LeDavid. So who has anybody ever heard the words Ayelet Hashachar?
I think so.
Yeah, probably.
Yes.
It's the name of a kibbutz.
Oh,
It's the name of a kibbutz in Israel. And I took one of the groups I took to Israel. We stayed at Ayelet HaShachar. And have you been to Ayelet HaShachar?
Yes.
It's in Northern Galilee, right?
What's that?
It's in Northern Galilee.
It's in the
Just about, yeah.
Galilee.
It's in the north.
Yeah, I think I've been there.
Okay. Have you ever tried to pray there?
No.
No.
No, it's a non-religious kibbutz.
No.
And so we were there over Shabbat, and I decided that, we should
Do something.
have tefillot Friday night. So I asked them if they had a synagogue. Oh, yes, we have a synagogue. I asked them how to get into this, where it was, which they had a hard time telling me where it was. They needed to find the key. They opened the synagogue, and was it musty. I don't think anybody'd been there in the last 15 years in the synagogue so Ayelet. So Barbara, translate for me Ayelet HaShachar.
Ayelet HaShachar is the Ayala, the what is that? An ibex of the dawn, a gazelle of the dawn.
A gazelle, a deer of the dawn.
Yeah.
So very strange. And as a matter of fact, you can see that in the English, it's simply translated as for the leader on Ayelet HaShachar, a Psalm of David, and there's an A there that refers to the A down here, meaning of Hebrew, uncertain. Well, it's not that we can't translate the words, we just don't know what's it doing there. The gazelle of the dawn. It's thought to be probably a known melody, the Ayelet HaShachar song. And so you're supposed to sing this psalm to the Ayelet HaShachar melody. Everybody know the Ayelet HaShachar melody? No, nobody knows what the Ayelet HaShachar melody. So this is for the band leader, Lamnatseach, with the melody of Ayelet HaShachar, a Psalm of David. Nice introduction, huh? So it begins with this famous line that is the only line that actually appears in the Christian scriptures, in Matthew and in Mark. Eli, 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 lama azavtani. My God, why have you abandoned me? So as Psalms which were attributed to David, what circumstance might this have been in David's life? Any suggestions?
Yeah,
When his son died,
Pardon me?
when his child died,
Okay, David is in mourning for his child. It's horrible.
when he was hiding out in Ein Gedi in the cave.
yeah,
Right, there are all these chapters where you have a mentally ill King Saul who is absolutely fixated on killing David. Why is he fixated on killing David?
He thinks he's going to take over as king.
Because the prophet Samuel told David that his son that he was grooming, Jonathan, will not become the next king.
Old
And
song.
Jonathan's friend is David, and there's several chapters where he's just absolutely determined to kill David, and these are really interesting chapters. So perhaps then, this child dies. Who is this child? This is the child of David and Bathsheba.
yeah.
Now you remember that David now commits every sin on all 10 commandments. David violates. He commits adultery. He murders Bathsheba's husband, or he has him murdered. And then Nathan comes and confronts him. I mean, David has a lot of crises in his life. So this could have been put into any one of those crises. But in Christian theology, this is one of the statements that Jesus makes on the cross. Why have you forsaken me? Let's see what we can do here. I'm going to get rid of this. And I'm going to go to here. Am I going to? Yeah. Can you see that one?
Nope. Nope.
Now you can see it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
Okay. So this is now, I couldn't get them all on one. I didn't have the, so here, this is lines 4. I don't know if I can make it any bigger. Not much. Oh, there.
Yeah.
That's a little bit better. So the first thing we want to look at line line 19. No, that doesn't.
Yeah.
No, we're gonna do a little out of order. So here we have line 8 and 9. All who see me mock me. They curl their lips. They shake their heads. Let him commit himself to the Lord. That is in quotations. Let him commit himself to the Lord. Let him rescue him. Let him save him, for he is pleased with him. Now, who says these words as far as Christian understanding of this psalm?
Conscious.
Let him commit himself to the Lord.
The
As far as-
Pharisees.
He's on the cross, right?
Yeah.
People who are watching, people who are observing,
The
and
Jews.
may feel like he's getting what he deserved.
Well, one can see this might be the chief priests and scribes, right, who have a really ambivalent relationship. Here's this guy who says who's attributed to him that he's the king of the Jews. So they say, let God save him. Let's watch this. Let him commit himself to the Lord. Let God rescue him. Let God save him. For God, supposedly God is pleased with him, right? Perhaps these are the unnamed, but you can see even in the, now understand the Hebrew has no quotation marks, but this is assumed to be I'm sorry, I can't show you the Hebrew at the same time. Let me see, where else do I want to look? So lines, I have to bring this down. No, it's not here. Wait a minute. There was 3. Verse 16. Is 16 there?
No.
14, 15. Oh yeah, 16 is there. My vigor dries up like a shard. My tongue cleaves to my palate. You commit me to the dust of death. What's that connected with the in one of the Gospels, I don't remember which one, Jesus asks for water. Jesus asks for drink. But let me go to the third section. I'll get rid of this. We'll go here. Okay, and we'll do
Let's be out of her chair.
screen share here too. Okay.
Where she sleeps.
So this is beginning with verse 17. Can you everybody see that? If I make it too big, then I can't see it myself. So verse 19, let's go up a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
They can't see us, but I can.
Okay, so verse 18 and 19. Evidently, so here it is, I take the count of my bones while they look on and gloat. They divide my clothes among themselves, casting lots for my garments. And in the Gospels, it says that actually the guards took Jesus's clothes. Now let me pull this over. Let me see if we can see the Hebrew, because the Gospel of John
See him up.
changes this a little bit. Yichalku bigdei lahem al levushi yapilu goral. Ever see the Hebrew there?
And I don't want to touch.
So in the first part of line
I'm
19,
not going to do that.
the clothing is in the plural, bigdei lahem. Begadai. I'm sorry. Yichalku begadai lahem. And in the second part, his clothes are referred to as levushi, which is singular. So in the book of John, it says that the guards divided up his clothes, except that his tunic, the main guard took. So John says that this is between the first phrase and the second phrase. First phrase is in the plural. Second phrase is in the singular for the word clothing. That all of this refers to Jesus. And the last thing, and we need to look both at the Hebrew and move this, is verse 17 and 18. Dogs surround me. A pack of evil ones closes in on me. Like lions, they maul my hands and feet. And you see that there's a little notation. I think the letter is E at the beginning of that line. Ever see that? The beginning and the end? Like lions, they maul my hands and feet. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay. Now, what it says at the bottom is, this is the translation according to Rashi. Because the Hebrew says, Ka'ari yadai v'raglai, which is like a lion, my hands and my feet. There's no verb there. And the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's very unclear what this word is. If it's like a lion, ari, like a lion, or if it's ka'aru, which he discusses in the text, because they translate this as piercing my hands and my feet. Why is that important? Because that's part of the story, that Jesus is pierced. And I have a Christian Bible here. And what verse is that? That verse was verse 17. And here in my translation is, dogs have surrounded me. A band of evil men has encircled me. They have pierced my hands and my feet. So that word pierced becomes very important for those people who claim that this entire psalm is a prophecy written by David, but a prophecy about Jesus. Anybody want to have any?
Would you win?
Where's my? There we go. Let me get rid of this again. Okay, that's all my show and tell.
Wait, okay.
Here we are.
Well, the,
Well, I had a question about the plural and the singular of bigdai and levush.
Yeah.
Levush can't be, levush isn't a word that is, can it be, I don't know that it can even be plural. Levush just means
Seems to know.
you're dressed. Like,
Yes. The
Yeah.
only different, and it's only, as she points out, only in the Gospel of John does he use this because the claim is that how did they divide up his clothes?
Right.
And levush just happens to be a singular, a collective word, meaning clothing.
Right, it's not, it can't be plural, is what I'm saying. It can't, it doesn't connote singular or plural.
Right.
It's just a way of, it means, dressing or something. I mean, anyway, it just sounds like a moot argument to me because I don't get, it isn't like bigadim is plural and levush is singular. Anyway,
No.
just another,
But in English, we basically do the same thing. I mean, we talk about
Yes,
use
we have the word
clothes.
clothing.
clothing
Clothes can be
It's made up
singular or
of many
plural.
things, but it's a singular word.
Yes.
Brother.
Right.
same
But
thing.
no, that's not.
But we're going to clam onto any little detail in order to see this. Now, Psalms was not meant to be prophetic. These were simply emotional statements, and not and not to predict something. Let me see. David is 1,000 years before Jesus. And we've pulled it apart. Number one, we say it's not David. Biblical scholars say it's not David. But it's still before the Babylonian exile. Most of these Psalms, they weren't all written at the same time, of course, and they weren't all written by the same author. But they're still 500, 600, 700 years before Jesus. Why do Jews, for the most part, don't read? Psalm 23 we read probably more often than any other psalm. The Lord is my shepherd.
I think that's Psalm
Adonai
140.
ro'i v'lo echsar. And here, this is the psalm just before it. Why don't we read it? For the most part.
It's so negative. It's
Well, but we have other ones that are. It's a lament, a personal. It's one of those real expressions. God, where are you? I'm in desperate circumstances here, and I need to have a sense of God's protection. I know there's no sense there's a sense of abandonment, but no sense that I don't believe. This is a real sense of I believe, and I don't understand why you're not there, why you're not there for me. I'm in a sense, I'm innocent. I don't deserve this.
Rabbi?
How many of you have been in that circumstance?
Mhm.
I think all
Rabbi?
of us at one point
Rabbi?
or another.
I got
Yep.
two questions, or one comment and a question. Comment is in reference to what you just said. Why is this not read more? If we think about things that our great composers have composed, whether it's Beethoven or Mozart or Brahms or whatever, there are some pieces that are very, very popular because people love to listen to them for whatever the composition may have, whatever combinations of instruments. And there's some that are hardly played at all, whether it's the length of them, whether it's the tonality of them. Maybe we have the same thing going on with the Psalms, that some were just more popular, easier to do, more comforting than others. But the question I have is this: if these are written anywhere between 700 years before the time of Jesus, were there people who in that 700 years we're looking for these kind of interpretations, these kind of messages coming from beyond, anticipating Jesus's life, or did these comments come about after, after Jesus was there, and as they're looking for him to have been
I know,
the
but
Messiah, were they then looking
This
for
is
proof of it?
this is camera.
It's, I think it's a very good question,
I do it.
because the answer is probably yes and no. The answer is that people look to Psalms for signs of what's happening, of when people were in, as a collective, often somehow trouble, and how do we get out of this? And maybe we can look to Psalms. Let me in answer to the my earlier question. Zubin Mehta was the head of the Israeli Philharmonic. And one of the things he wanted very badly, he wasn't Jewish. He wanted to play Wagner.
Mhm.
The claim was, how can a major orchestra in the world not play Wagner, arguably one of the greatest composers in the world? And he was turned down. You can't play Wagner. Wagner was an anti-Semite. He was a bastard, and therefore we don't care how good the music is. The Israeli Philharmonic is not going to play Wagner. Now that may be a very bad analogy, but I'm using that as an analogy. If this is central to Christian theology, we're not interested.
Yep.
We're not going to we're not cutting it out of the book. We're not saying we go from Psalm 21 to 23 and skip 22. It's still there. But we're not going to say it every day. Even so, we have other Psalms that we do say every day that are very similar to this one.
He's got 23 feet.
But wasn't Jesus, the whole idea when he says, "Oh God, why have you mistaken me," is that he was talking basically to his father, as the Son of God.
Jesus never claimed to be the Son of God.
But in fact, in this chapter, you will have seen that Jews did see this psalm as reflecting another biblical story, not Jesus, but as reflecting the story of Esther.
Oh, Esther.
Which is sort of interesting. Now, in the book, one of the interesting things about the entire book of Esther, first of all, interestingly, the book of Esther is in the Christian scripture. They don't read it a lot. It's not important. For us, it's interesting. You have a big scripture, a lot of text. You can emphasize certain ones, you can de-emphasize, and sometimes you emphasize or de-emphasize based on what the other guys think. Esther does not play a significant role in the Christian year, the entire book. We do that. This is important to you. It's not important to us. We don't think very much of it. One of the things that you might remember about the book of Esther is that God is not mentioned in the book of Esther. There's no mention of God, and many interpreters say there's no mention of God because this is the book of Esther. One of the attempts at explaining how can you have a book that's in the Bible that doesn't mention God? It's the only narrative that takes place completely outside the land of Israel.
Right.
And therefore, that's a much later explanation why God doesn't appear. Even so, there are several places in the book of Esther where God might appear. right? When she says to her cousin Mordecai, go and fast for me before I go into the king. Wouldn't that have been an appropriate place for her to say, go and pray to God for my welfare? There are several places where God is assumed in the background, but not mentioned. So here, and I'm looking at page.
Well,
Anybody
can we interpret Esther as the prototype of the secular Jew?
Yeah, except that, well, Phil, you might take this. So here, in the Talmud, we read the following. This is from Parsha from Masechet Megillah. The verse states with regard to Esther, and she stood in the inner court of the king's house. Esther 5:1. At what point does she stand in the inner court? Remember, she has been told by her cousin about the king's order to kill all the Jews. He says to her, you have to go to the king. She says, I can't go to the king because you can't go uninvited. And Mordecai then says to her, who knows, but he says, if you don't go, Jews will be saved, but you won't. And who knows, but you have been appointed to this position precisely for this moment. And finally, she says she'll go. So, okay, so she stood in the inner court of the king's house, and the Talmud says the following. Rabbi Levi said, once she reached the chamber of the idols, she's on her way to go to the king. Obviously, she has to go through the chamber of the idols, which was in the inner court. The divine presence, the Shekhinah, left her. She immediately said, Eli, Eli, lama azavtani. My God, why have you forsaken me? Perhaps it's because you judge an unintentional sin as one performed intentionally, and an action done to circumstances beyond one's control as one done willingly. She said, I'm here among the idols. You may think that this I'm doing the wrong thing, but I have don't leave me. I think it's a wonderful description. And she says, so this is, or perhaps you have left me because in my prayers I called Haman a dog. As it is stated, deliver my soul from the sword, my only one from the hand of the dog. She at once retracted and called him in her prayers a lion. As it is stated in the following verse, save me from the lion's mouth. So the author of our chapter says that there actually is a longer version of the book of Esther. Rabbinic connection to Esther, to Psalm 22, has good precedence. The Septuagint version of Esther, which is longer than the Hebrew version, contains several additions. Isn't that interesting? I've never seen that before, that evidently the Septuagint, which is simply supposed to be a Greek translation of the text, in this case of Esther, and I don't know if there are other cases too, there were additional pieces that aren't in our Tanakh, and they may have been influenced by Psalm 22.
That's up to you. I think it'd be better if you got dressed.
And it goes on to so
Needs to be.
we say if it has any, and there were some traditions that when do you say the book Psalm 22? Only in connection with Purim.
Something here.
We say because this psalm refers to Esther And I wouldn't be surprised. I'm sure that this is probably, as I think she indicates, or they indicate here, this is probably post connection with Jesus. This is an anti-Christological interpretation. You say it's about Jesus? Ha! It's not about Jesus. It's about Esther.
Did the Christians include those extra verses in their book of Esther that they have in their
I don't know.
I mean,
I don't know, which is a good question, because almost all of their interpretations of these verses that we've seen over these chapters is based on the Septuagint translation rather than the original Hebrew. So they actually say, the line here, I don't have page numbers. It's likely that such association of Psalms with Esther reflects an anti-Christian polemic. We did that. We did this kind of stuff back and forth. The psalm is about the queen in her distress and not about Jesus on the cross. Conversely, in 398 CE, Jerome insisted that this psalm should be understood in reference to Mordecai and Esther. Should not be understood in reference to Mordecai and Esther. He knew that his Jewish neighbors were doing this. To this day, ironically, while the book of Esther is read in its entirety on Purim, it plays at best a minor role in Christian lectionaries, which is what I mentioned before. So in Jewish tradition, it's not only mainly connected with Esther, it's also connected with David, which we talked about before. For example, in Midrash Psalms, most of which was likely composed before the 8th century, reads, while David was tending sheep, he came upon, this is an interesting story, he came upon a re'em. In rabbinic literature, a mythological, gigantic bull-like figure. We might think of an enormous unicorn. He came upon this re'em asleep in the wilderness, and thinking it was a mountain, he climbed upon it and continued to tend his sheep. Remember, David was a shepherd. The re'em, waking up, arose, and David, astride of its horns, was lifted up as high as the heavens. At that moment, David said, Master of the universe, if thou bringest me down from the horns of the re'em, I shall build thee a temple. What did the Holy One, blessed be he, do for David? He caused a lion to come toward the re'em. Why the mention of a lion? There's a mention of a lion in Psalm 22, the mention of animals. And when the re'em saw the lion, he was frightened and cringed before it. When David saw the lion, he also was afraid of it. Thereupon the Holy One, blessed be he, caused a gazelle to come along. And as the lion sprang away after it, David descended and went his way. So in the second part of that psalm, there's a lot of mention of different animals: gazelle, a lion. So that's where this. And then there's actually in Jewish tradition a sense that Psalm 22 is about a Messiah, not their Messiah. not their Messiah. The main Jewish source for a messianic reading of Psalm 22 is Psikta Rabbati, a midrash containing material as early as the 1st century. It was lost in the Middle Ages and was not very influential, though sections of it were preserved through quotations in other works. Its main claim in the section concerning Psalm 22 is that the I who laments is the Messiah ben Ephraim, sometimes called Mashiach Ephraim, a messianic figure who precedes the main Davidic Messiah, and according to a few rabbinic texts, dies a martyr. Applying this psalm to him is an attempt to show that it couldn't possibly refer to Jesus.
Rabbi Isaac, I have a question in general about false messiahs. So we know throughout history, there were different false messiahs, and it was something that Priscilla said about the use of the Psalms before Jesus. So leading up to Jesus, that is like a huge false messiah that we all know. Were there other false messiahs that were embraced before that? I know there were after that, like Sabtai Shvi and stuff, but what about before Jesus? Were there any false messiahs, and did they use scripture in this way to justify their messiahness?
I think this justification is actually later. I think first there are my sense is first there were charismatic figures who attracted audiences, certainly during times of enormous political and social crisis. I'm not sure that they needed literary backup. The question was whether they were, whether they attracted, a following. And yes, we've had. So I would have to look this. The whole large chapter in Jewish tradition about false messiahs and the damage that they did through the centuries. I don't know about. I'd have to look up false messiahs earlier than Jesus.
Rabbi, I was always under the impression that Jesus never claimed to be the Messiah, but his followers did.
Yes. I think that's not entirely clear either. There aren't that many quotations of Jesus, actually, even in the New Testament, that are attributed to him, and it's somehow putting the different gospel stories together into one cohesive story, because there are really so many contradictions.
Contradictions, yeah.
And one of the lines I underlined here: while it is possible that the Jewish messianic reading of Psalm 22 arose independently of Christian claims, we find the view that it served to counter Christian readings more convincing. I suppose you have had these experiences too, where you have been confronted by an usually an evangelical young person, who wants to prove to you through using biblical sources that it's self-evident that of Jesus' divinity. And they, will open up the Bible, and we'll show you Psalm 22 and say, how can you possibly not accept the truth? There it is, right in front of you in black and white. And of course, when that happens, we're not prepared with this particular. I was not unfamiliar with Psalm 22. Had they given me Psalm 145, I could have recited to them by heart, or Psalm 23. With some Psalms we are very familiar with because they are part of our tradition. But do I know all 150? No. I would say I know. I could tell you, give you a good sense of 10 of them. And I can then study the others one after the other. One last line I want to add here: many medieval Jewish interpreters largely follow the outlines of the Talmud Midrashim, though some engage more clearly with the anti-Christian readings of Psalm 22. Rashi's glosses may seem as implicitly anti-Christian. He interprets the psalm communally about all of Israel. First, by asserting that its superscription, the deer of the dawn, Ayelet HaShachar, refers to the congregation of Israel. I have no idea what it refers to, but Rashi knows. Who is the congregation of who is a loving doe that shines through like the dawn. At the same time, he observes our rabbis interpreted it as a reference to Esther. Rashi notes that David wrote, "Why have you forsaken me?" in reference to the future exile. So we're each reading these texts with our own background. When the Psalms, which are really very, very beautiful, unless you read them in Old English, then of course they don't mean anything.
I have a question.
Yeah, Trudy.
So when someone like that confronts you, which has not happened to me, but probably to you, what is your response?
I would say I really have to study that text more closely and see if the interpretations I have from my sources are similar. Priscilla?
Yeah, kind of want to step back and look at the whole gestalt here. If in our background, in our prayers and our psalms and what we have, there is the promise, there is the notion of a Mashiach, and we're still waiting for that. And even in today's world, in Judaism, you have some parts of Judaism, some arms of it that are very, very clear that there is a Messiah, that there will be a Messiah, that we're just waiting. I think about the invitations that come from Chabad for a wedding or bar mitzvah or something saying on this date, or unless the Messiah comes before then. So it's a very real thing to be waiting. As sure as we have this and our ways of saying we're waiting, it seems to me that Christians are as clear on their interpretation that Jesus was, and they're just waiting for that return. Is it that because are we as a people more looking for answers? Our tradition is we question, we delve, we explain, we modify that explanation, and we're constantly evolving. Is that just our nature, or are Christians so convinced that they have what they have, or that this was it, that they're not open to interpretation? I'm not sure if I've voiced the question, but I hope I presented what I'm asking.
I'm speaking to you for the most part to a Jewish audience.
Yeah.
If you were a Christian audience, you would read this book very differently. Elaine Shapiro is reading this book with other professors from the University of Portland. She has a small group of women, Jewish and non-Jewish. And so we've had correspondence back and forth. She's not as far along as we are. They're sort of reading it out loud and talking about it together. And the issue isn't right or wrong here. The issue isn't, how could they come up with such nonsense? That's not the issue. The issue is we really begin with different assumptions. And that becomes very important. So does it do harm to read into this psalm what Christians see as the truth? No, I don't think it does any harm. It is, we bring interpretations to texts that are that fit to who we are and what we come with. Yeah, we're reading this, and and these associations are foreign to us. They are new to us. They are unfamiliar to us, but we bring other assumptions about what certain stories mean and how they and how to explain them. In fact, what is this psalm all about? The psalm is really a plaintive plea by any human being who's suffering from COVID, who is desperate in one way or another, who is doesn't know how to feed his kids. Why? It's clear that this is not a psalm for a non-believer. This is a psalm for a believer. This is a psalm for
Any believer.
I'm trying, God, and all these terrible things have happened to me. And it's hard for me to explain them.
Well, who is it who wrote when God? I'm trying to remember the book of 30 years ago, by this rabbi. When God doesn't speak to people, what was the name?
When bad things happen to good people, it was Harold Kushner.
When bad things happen to good people, and that's just what he was trying to express. That God was not ruling our lives, and bad things could happen to good people. And of course, he became very famous for that. And I remember when he was here in Portland, and
a few times
he gave a lecture. I mean, we had a packed audience at the synagogue, and there were several sisters there, Christian sisters. And I spoke to them later because I knew them. And they said, well, we're still asking that same question.
Yeah, I mean, Harold in his writings was speaking really to he was writing to a Jewish audience, but he was speaking but there was a much bigger audience that was very attracted to what he had to say. Interestingly enough, Martin Buber, a Jew had much bigger influence on Protestantism than he had on Judaism. So here it's as we have in several of the biblical stories that I said before. If you read a text, in this case a psalm, and you read it and you say, oh my God, that's the same story as Esther. That's the same story as Jesus. Now you look even closer, and you pull out all the interpretations, because it answers all kinds of questions. So really, we should have done this class. Maybe we should do it again. And I should do it with a Protestant minister or a Catholic priest.
Mhm.
We make it shorter.
I think one of the challenges, and I don't know, I'm interested in your feedback. First of all, I find some chapters much easier to read than others.
Yes.
For instance, chapter on the virgin birth, I thought was a much more straightforward chapter. But then I thought there was an awful lot of confusing material that was put in, and I wondered whether it's difficult. Difficult for a lay person to read it. Have you found reading these chapters difficult?
Yes.
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 I have
Pick an easier book next time, please.
You know, I'm in a book group with Lee, and we're reading a book about mushrooms this month.
This is, thanks for bringing that up. It's far more information than I could possibly want.
I'm reading it, and I'm having a hard time making heads or tails out of it.
It's, you're not the only one, Rabbi.
So, there's a fungus among us, but it's
okay.
So I don't know whether this book could have been written easier to read. But I think it's not a book that's accessible to easily accessible to a lay audience.
Agreed. And if you're having trouble, you're not a lay audience.
I had to read some of these chapters twice, 2 or 3 times over to see now how can I make heads or tails of it? How can I try and present it in some sort of coherent fashion? So this was chapter 11, right? Next week we have chapter 12.
Son of man.
And then there's a very short chapter 13. So we'll see what we do with that. So
13, I thought there was 14.
I'll see everybody next week.
Thank you so much.